Okay, so Francesco, and actually Francesco is a professor of philosophy of language only, but he and his collaborators work also at the Cosmic Lab at Roma Tre University, which is cognition, social multimodal interaction and communication. For a decade or so, they were focused on the problem of language evolution, on which they published extensively, and their particular area of interest are narrative origins of language, where they highlight the role of pantomime as the original narrative medium. And in this regard, they conducted research on mental time travel, pantomime in children on the autistic spectrum, on the autism spectrum, or intercultural differences in pantomime. And these are the subjects when we had the opportunity to collaborate with Francesco and his team. And the idea that they are, or Francesco in particular, are developing recently is the role of persuasion in the evolution of language. So I'm sure we will hear a lot about this during their talk. The title of which is quite similar to the previous one, but I guess they will take a different perspective on the problem of narrative, pantomime and language evolution. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So thanks a lot. Okay, so in this presentation, I'm going to present on behalf of Francesco, Ines, and I, of course, and our talk is specifically on theoretical hypothesis on the role of pantomime in the origins of language, and specifically on the role of narrative pantomime, as we will see. This is the outline of our presentation. We move under the framework of pantomimic accounts of language origins, and specifically here we present evolutionary hypothesis which considers pantomime to be at the foundation of language origins. This hypothesis, the specific hypothesis, is that pantomime could have represented a form of proto-language for two main reasons. The first one is that pantomime can be viewed as a powerful narrative tool, so a system able to convey stories. And the second reason, which is strictly intertwined with the first one, is that pantomime can be a powerful means of persuasion. So these 2 points are intertwined in our view, because in our view, the origin of language is tied to the ability to tell stories at the beginning, as we will see, in the absence of a verbal language. And to understand why we endorse such a view, we need to start from a broader conception about the nature of communication. So we will make reference to the idea that human communication can be seen as a form of persuasion. The idea will be that human language evolved to change the other's beliefs and attitudes, so to make them act in a certain way. And with the aim of enhancing persuasive strategies, humans created, in our opinion, a specific way to persuade others by inventing narrative. So narrative persuasion, proto-narrative persuasion, so embracing the Arbib's suggestions, is the specific of humans, is what distinguishes human communication from animal communication. And pantomime is the system that gave shape to these early forms of narrative persuasion. Our hypothesis is founded on two main arguments, so we will try to discuss these arguments. The first one refers to the idea that narrative is the specific way in which humans represent reality. So there is a narrative thought made possible by specific cognitive systems. And this is an argument concerning the structural conditions of proto-language. And the other argument concerns the material conditions of proto-language. So we will see that pantomime is the specific expressive systems that our ancestors could use to convey narrative representations. In the final part of this talk, we will see that pantomime can be considered as a truly form of proto-language because it has specific features that provide the conditions of possibility for the advent of modern language. So as I said before, as I mentioned, a first step to outline this hypothesis is to take into consideration the model of communication, which is more useful in our view. In the literature, there are two main models about the nature of animal communication, the informative model and the manipulative model. According to the informative model, the main function of communication is to transmit information through the production and perception of signals. On the other hand, the manipulative model of communication, which has been advanced by Krebs and Dawkins and then developed by other scholars, views animal communication as more competitive and evolving to manipulate receivers. So in this view, signals serve to make the receiver respond in a certain way, in ways that provide advantages for the sender, regardless of any benefit for the receiver. It appears also intuitive that there should be a dichotomy between these two kind of models. But in the literature, there are also hybrid models which try to keep together manipulation and information. And we commit to such a kind of model because it's a model that highlights that framing communication in terms of influence is not a way to deny the importance of the information content in communication, but it's a way to question the idea that the exclusive reference to the transmission of information can provide a comprehensive account of communication. So the advantage of framing human communication in reference to a hybrid model rests on the possibility to emphasize the manipulative character of communication, which is important in communication and which in other models is completely undermined. Okay, starting from this general framework, it should be highlighted that the manipulative model has some difficulties when it is applied to human communication. And in particular, the difficulty concern the dealing with criticism which regard the passivity of the recipients. The criticism toward the passive role of the recipients basically concerns 2 points. The first one refers to evolutionary issues. So within the manipulative models, the adaptive benefit seems to be exclusively on the side of the actor. And so it seems unclear how why the receiver should be selected to reply to the sender in a communicative context, as is highlighted in this quotation by Seifert and colleagues. And the second criticism on the passive role of the recipient has to do with the nature of human communication. We know from our basic intuitions that the listener is not a passive subject in the communication process. And these intuitions are also confirmed by some empirical research. For example, it has been shown that a critical feature of human communication is the listener's defense towards the persuasive intentions of the speaker. So when the listener recognizes the persuasive intentions, she develops defensive strategies that has been termed by Ferretti and colleagues epistemic vigilance. And through these strategies, which comprise defensive but also monitoring mechanisms, the listener can evaluate the truthfulness of what the speaker is saying and can actively take part in communication. Mercier has particularly stressed this point, undermining the idea that listeners are prone to accept information. Instead, the automatic responses of listeners when faced with the persuasive intention of the speaker is always to contrast those intentions. So the reference to epistemic vigilance, on the one hand, contributes to explain why it is misleading to consider communication as a matter of influence in terms of a passive role of the addressee. And on the other hand, also highlights the fact that the speaker has always a complex task when he needs to realize his persuasive strategies. Since the addressee can understand a message without accepting that message, the speaker should not only try to be understood, but also aiming at convincing the listener to think or act in a certain way. So this idea that the listener has an active role in communication has important implications also in an evolutionary perspective. The idea is that the speaker's effort to overcome epistemic vigilance prompt the invention, the creation of new persuasive strategies in humans. And these new persuasive strategies make human communication very different from the manipulative model of animal communication. Specifically on these points, Ferretti and colleagues argue that speakers developed strategies based on reasoning and argumentation. This is an important point for investigating the nature of proto-language, because arguments are basically kind of inferences and are generally assumed to be to rely on the constituent structure of sentences, which in turn presumes verbal language. So the argumentative theory of communication relies on a sophisticated expressive system at the grammatical level. As we will see, argumentation characterizing epistemic vigilance is particularly effective for persuasion. However, here we should highlight that from an evolutionary perspective, assuming a complex syntactic code from the very beginning is challenging, because it's exactly what we should try to explain, to account for, then argumentation is likely to represent a late product of evolution rather than a starting platform for language emergence. So although being extremely effective on a persuasive level, argumentation cannot be a good candidate to account for the nature of proto-language and as per language origins. What we need, in our opinion, is an intermediate step between animal persuasive communication and human argumentative communication. Understanding the nature of this step means hypothesizing a form of proto-language that was capable of enhancing the persuasive efficacy of communication without involving the use of persuasive arguments. And our proposal concerns exactly this point, and is that in the early stages of language evolution, the enhancement of persuasive abilities led to proto-narrative strategies that were persuasive without being argumentative. So before using arguments and grammar to communicate, archaic hominins gave rise to persuasive communication by narrating stories. Now we'll try to explain why narrative is a persuasive form of communication. In the meantime, just a brief definition which is required. As Jordan highlighted in the debate, mostly within narratology, there are many definitions of pantomime, but there is a general definition of narrative, but there is a general definition which reaches consent, and is the idea that narrative is a primary resource for configuring events into more or less coherent scenarios involving the experience of persons. So we will start by this conception, and on this basis we say that there are several reasons to consider narrative as an excellent means of persuasion. We will focus just on two of the main mechanisms accounting for this character, which are transportation and engagement. There's a wide literature which describes stories as means that have the power of flying under the radar. So the idea is that stories can allow to achieve the storyteller's persuasive aim, hiding a persuasive intent. So in this way, stories have a particular capacity, can bypass the natural defensive reaction of the audience. We make reference to this aspect of stories because this is pre-argumentative way of achieving persuasion that relies on mechanism of transportation and engagement. According to this model proposed by Green and Brock, which is the transportation imagery model, the reader loses access to some real-world facts in favor of accepting the narrative world that the author has created. So in this way, while the reader is immersed in the story, she may be less aware of the real-world facts, and this will undermine her ability to counter-argue, so making her more willing to accept the story claims and thus more easily swayed. In this view, most of the persuasive power of stories lies in their ability to communicate a persuasive message while minimizing reactance, resistance, or counter-arguing in audience. A reason why an aspect which underlines this persuasive power of narrative is the emotional effects that stories can elicit in the audience. So we can view argumentation and narrative as basically effective means of persuasion that exploit distinct principles and strategies. Obviously, we think that human communication makes use of both these means, but proto-narrative has a logical and temporal priority over argumentation, since, as we said before, being based on inferential structure, argumentation is likely to be a late product of evolution. The question now is understanding how to understand how our ancestor could narrate for persuasive aims before the advent of verbal language, so which is our specific hypothesis on proto-language. Our hypothesis is that they could do that through a form of narrative proto-language. And to understand the nature of this intermediate step, we will make reference to two conditions on which narrative proto-language rested on: structural conditions, so the cognitive system involved in a narrative modality of thought which precedes the expression of narratives, and material conditions, so the expressive system which was suitable for conveying stories without language. Let's start with the first point concerning the structural conditions. As we emphasized the role of transportation and engagement in persuasion, the cognitive systems underlying narrative persuasion must be capable of accounting for these two mechanisms. And in this regard, two main cognitive systems seem relevant. The cognitive system which underlines spatial and temporal projection, and the cognitive system at the basis of social simulation. The system of spatial and temporal projection are crucial for transportation because they allow the subject who is processing the story to project from the current location into the narrative by means of a process of scenario construction, which has been acknowledged to be an important aspect of narrative comprehension and production. because this allows to construct a mental model of the narrative, binding together multiple elements of imagined scenes. The systems involved in social simulation are instead used to give meaning to the actions of the character. So they are critical to create forms of engagement with the story characters by allowing to enter into their life, simulating their thoughts, their beliefs, their feelings, and so on. This network of cognitive devices serving for different kinds of mental projection comprises the most relevant systems of the narrative brain, specifically those which pertain to persuasive narrative. But of course, they are wider. They are systems not specific to language, which is interesting. So they can be present to various degrees in some non-human animals. The emphasis on the role of the narrative brain allows to show how our ancestors could represent reality in a narrative form. So in the view we propose, narrative is a modality of thought long before a modality of communication. But more importantly, narrative as a cognitive modality, so the narrative brain also affects the possible forms of semiotic resources. So constrain the expressive system to exhibit certain features, in this case, that's allowed to convey narrative forms of thought and therefore to realize the persuasive intent. In our proposal, in our hypothesis, the most suitable system embodying these characteristics is represented by pantomime, and more specifically by a form of pantomimic storytelling, which therefore is mainly a system that emerged to express narrative thought. And why it can be considered as a precursor to human language, so a form of proto-language, because it possesses the main features that distinguishes human language from animal communication. It is an ideal means to persuade others by telling stories without language through pre-argumentative forms of communication. To understand how pantomime could be a means of persuasive proto-narrative, we do need a good definition of pantomime. And in the literature on language evolution that views pantomime as an important stepping stone in the evolution of language, the definition of pantomime is very variable and can include the narrative fact or not. Many of these accounts have in common the use of the term pantomime in a general manner. So, for example, Arbib describes pantomime as the ability of expressing a situation, object, action, character, or emotion without words, and using only gestures, especially imitative gestures and other movements. Well, this is a basic definition, which is very similar to the idea that pantomime is an iconic mode of communication conveyed through manual gesturing. And this is a very important definition as highlight important features that are crucial for a scenario of language origins. For example, the ability to create an open-ended set of complex messages exploiting open-ended manual skills. So we start from this definition, but with the aim of endorsing a view in which pantomime could be a means of persuasive proto-narrative, we try to extend this definition to a more articulated conception that could include specific features making pantomime able to convey narrative contents, and so persuasion. To this aim, we combine two definitions that have been independently proposed by McNeill on one side and Dziewiczinski and colleague on the other side. Definition which taken individually, had some limitations for our purposes. For example, McNeill proposed a good definition which perfectly fits with our hypothesis, since it makes an explicit reference to narrative. He describes pantomime as a gesture sequence of gestures conveying a narrative line with a story to tell produced without speech. So in his view, sequence of gestures can do this because they can pack meanings in a global way, moving from whole to parts. However, a problematic aspect of this of McNeill's hypothesis is that this potential of pantomime does not fit with the pantomimic scenario of language evolution, since he considers pantomime as an evolutionary dead end, nothing have to do with language, that from the very beginning relies on an integrated system of gesture and speech, while pantomime is viewed as a silent gesture. Dziewiczinski and colleagues have challenged this point, and they have showed that pantomime is multimodal, involving different sensory channels, is polysemiotic, combining from its very beginning different semiotic modalities along with the visual one. And they provide a rich definition, which is the official one, which you mentioned before, Jordan and Professor Arbi. And it is particularly interesting, this definition, for our purposes. In particular, we should put the emphasis on the multimodal polysemiotic character of pantomime and on the, as well as on the holistic nature of pantomime. The fact that pantomime can refer to whole events in an holistic continuous trend in the stream of movement. So this aspect is particularly relevant as endorsed a narrative conception of pantomimic communication. However, Dziewiczinski and colleagues do not make explicit reference to narrative, so they do not include narrative as a character of pantomime in this definition. In our view, by integrating these two definitions, so by keeping together the holistic, multimodal, polysemiotic character of pantomime with the narrative plan, so we can raise the hypothesis that pantomimic communication represented a real scaffolding for expressing narrative thoughts long before the advent of verbal language. So the idea is that our ancestors could exploit pantomime to persuade others without using argumentation. Just to illustrate the effectiveness of this combined definition, I would like to show you very quickly this example, which is a stimulus of an experiment we are going to run in an empirical research on the comprehension of pantomime. Since in the context of language evolution, there are no studies explicitly addressing the possibility that pantomime could be used to convey narrative contents, we're thinking of using this kind of material to explore the potential of the narrative potential of narrative. Okay, maybe in the discussion we can talk about it if you want, but the idea is that a storyline is conveyed through this kind of pantomime, and we would like to see also the relationship between the comprehension of this kind of pantomimic storytelling, and other cognitive abilities. Also maybe in clinical populations, which may provide a unique window in the early stages of language evolution. In recent debates on the evolutionary emergence of human communication, some models have recognized the potential of pantomime in conveying narrative contents. However, none of these accounts links pantomime to persuasion, which instead, in our hypothesis, is the aspect which makes pantomime a form of proto-language. So the fact that our ancestors could use pantomimes to not only to communicate to others narrative representations, but primarily to convince others of something. So the persuasive function is the major selective pressure that prompted the evolution of communication. We think that the pictorial and imagistic character of the pantomimic modality is the relevant feature in this respect. Research has shown that pantomime has the ability to convey aspects of an imagery whole, evoking ideas of the pantomime action or event and directing imagination of the recipients. So pantomime takes advantage of imagery mechanisms to convey persuasive stories at a pre-argumentative level, eliciting visual representation of a narrative scene that enhance the transportative experience into story world. So what we have said so far highlights why pantomime can be considered a precursor to the typically human persuasive communication. So through the telling of stories, it can improve the persuasive abilities already present in other forms of animal communication. However, today we use a very different expressive system to communicate with each other. So the question is, which reasons explain why our ancestors moved to other new expressive modalities? And to answer this question, we need to take a position in the debate concerning the switch from pantomimic communication to verbal language, which usually considers the limitation and difficulty of pantomime. There's a wide literature stressing the discontinuity between an iconic motivated modality and an abstract symbolic modality typical of verbal language. For example, Arbib mentioned this example in which it is hard for pantomime to convey shades of meaning, like bird and flying. Similarly, Corballis highlighted that pantomime is inefficient and often ambiguous, and this push towards a system of symbol used to disambiguate meanings. We will also say that pantomime does not allow the expression of important features of modern day storytelling, like reverse chronological order. So in this way, it can convey just proto-stories. But in addition to this limitation, we would like to stress further aspects that are specifically related to persuasion and that should be added in the debate on the limitations of pantomime. In particular, our proposal is that the switch to verbal language was motivated by specific reasons concerning the nature of communication, when communication becomes particularly sophisticated and moves from the one-to-many modality to the vis-a-vis modality. There are indeed indications which show that pantomime is very useful in one-to-many communicative strategies. For example, by exploiting the imagistic and emotional plan, a triple leader through pantomimic storytelling can elicit transportation and engagement. But when communication moves towards a face-to-face modality, which implies aspects such as turn-taking and effortful strategies of reciprocal persuasion, then pantomime does not appear to be suitable. To convince someone who might have a different point of view and is prone to defend that point of view through counter-arguments, the imagistic scenarios elicited by pantomime are not enough. So the idea is that conversational dialectics requires a further ability which involves advanced forms of reasoning and inferential thought. In the first part of the talk, we stressed the active role of the listener, who put in place various strategies for resisting persuasion. And these strategies imply a continuous exchange of arguing and counter-arguing between the speakers that purposely involve a two-way mechanism in which actors and reactors exchange roles in the attempt to make the other party to believe and do what she expects to believe and do. And we refer to this important mechanism of human communication in terms of persuasive reciprocity. as we said before, this level requires an inferential structure which relies on propositions. This implies that the enhancement of the argumentative structure of narrative depends on the enhancement of propositional structures on which inferences are based. So in this perspective, the evolution of a new complex expressive system at the grammatical level that was able of articulating thoughts in the form of arguments becomes an important factor in order to both support and defend one's own point of view. So in our hypothesis, grammar emerged at the service of inferences and therefore of argumentative structures to be used in persuasion. And more generally, the selective pressure towards more effective forms of persuasive communication are at the basis of narrative communication before and later, with the emergence of persuasive reciprocity at the level of conversation, at the basis of argumentative grammar. In our view, this scenario fostered the transition from pantomime to the emergence of modern language, which combines together grammar and verbalization, reconstructing at a different level the basic features of the previous expressive system. So this means that once language emerges, it provides constructions that reshape the structure of proto-narrative. And this is why modern storytelling is the result of a feedback loop between narrative and language. So to sum up, we're starting from the idea that animal communication is persuasive, and we propose that archaic hominins communication was persuasive as inherently narrative, pre-argumentative. Today, modern human communication is persuasive as combining narrative and argumentation. And starting from this structure, a plausible evolutionary scenario trajectory for language evolution would be that in the early stages of communication, archaic hominins who were endowed with a narrative brain developed a way to express their narrative representation through pantomimic storytelling. Then this rudimentary form of storytelling provided an evolutionary platform for the bootstrapping of more complex narrative forms of communication, so with greater efficiency and persuasive power. And in this framework, pantomime can be framed as a truly form of proto-language, which gradually led to modern verbal language characterized by the persuasive reciprocity of the conversational level. Thank you.
Questions, comments? Thank you very much, Ale.
Thank you very much, Alexander, and the rest of the Romans. It helped me understand the paper that you contributed better.
Excuse me, but I can't hear you.
You cannot hear me?
No? Okay, yes.
It's okay now, okay. Thank you very much. I think that this transition from you call them proto-narratives or proto-stories. We're calling them simple narratives, expressed through pantomime, to more complex ones. That we can discuss that later. And I think that this going from like one directional communication to conversation is certainly a factor to consider. I think we also agree that pantomime can manage pretty well the task of simple narrative communication, right? What I still don't understand is what you mentioned in the talk, and you have in the paper also, that narrative is a modality of thought long before a modality of communication. And I'm wondering why your commitment to this claim and whether you need it, because this is where we haven't been able to agree the last 5 years. What's the evidence for it? And I mean, since we said without narration, is there any real narrative? Is pantomime and then language just an externalization of an already existing internal narrative?
Yes, I wrote in my notes, no narration, no narrative. And I wrote the reverse, no narrative, no narration. we talked about it in the last years, in the past years, about this different perspective on how to tell the emergence of narrative. So, as you know, we think this is a necessary step, making reference to the cognitive underpinnings and the cognitive conditions and possibility of narrative, exactly because these are conditions of possibility. If we don't have a narrative brain that is ready to process stories, we can have stories with certain features. So the features that are that we see in narration, in stories, in the semiotic resources we have, are also the result of some cognitive constraints. So this is the reason why we can undermine the role of these aspects. And we should construct an hypothesis that put together the cognitive and the semiotic aspects narrative.
Right. Just for us, narrative is equal to narration plus story, right? So if you have no narration, you have no narrative, and you have no story, you have no narrative, right? So what you're saying now is that, I mean, without the right kind of cognition, you cannot have the story, and I agree with that. But maybe the temporal claim, I'm not sure about. Narrative is a modality of thought long before a modality of communication. I mean, this is like saying that a story can exist without being externalized. And isn't it like a very internalist evolutionary story? And we know from generative grammar, etc., that it's very hard to find evidence for internalist approaches.
Sorry, Jordan. Hi, everybody. I'm Francesco. Can you hear me correctly? Yes. Okay. Probably this is the point of the disagreement with us for a long time, because in our opinion, the short answer to your question is the reference of the narrative brain. Narrative brain is the way to represent reality in form of narrative. Because, for example, narrative are temporal dimension, and to comprehend the temporal dimension of narrative, we need something like time travel. That is a specific component of our brain. So the extended dimension of narrative and the extended dimension of the narrative representation realities is strictly tied to the ability in our brain to navigate the time. So this is something that is not relevant for communicate, because it's just at the beginning a function for cognition. We can represent reality in form of representation. The expression, here we need a semiotic and expressive component, is a secondary problem in this story, because the difference between our typical form of representation and reality from other animals is this form of representation, narrative representation. It's because of the fact that we can represent reality in the form of a story, that we can tell stories to the others, and not vice versa. This is at the beginning. In the second time, we can say that the ability to tell stories is part of our representation of realities. This is a feedback loop between. But at the beginning of the process in evolution of proto-language, there is our specific brain and our specific representation of reality in form of a story.
Thank you. I guess we will continue this discussion in the next decade. Just to say that, I guess it sounds like it would be easier to agree on a definition of pantomime than on a definition of narrative.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks a lot. I have a question about something you said on one of your slides, that pantomime is a form of proto-language. And I was wondering how that kind of fits into, for example, what Michael has said in his view of that, basically kind of that pantomime comes first, and then you have proto-speech and proto-sign. And that pantomime is not so much a system. And so what do you think about this like alternative view that pantomime is not so much a system, but it's kind of an ability to use kind of pantomimic communication, but a proto-language is something that has some degree of conventionalization, some degree of diffusion, and that pantomime does not have conventionalization because that's like the next step. So that's why I was wondering whether we can say pantomime is a proto-language or pantomime is something that when it becomes conventionalized and usualized and diffused, then kind of is like a proto-language.
Yeah, we agree with you that conventionalization is a second step, but the first step must be a form of communication without conventionalization, because conventionalization is just a form of just a second step. So pantomime is the best form of communication without conventionalization at the beginning. This is I don't know if I correctly understood the answer to your question, but conventionalization is just a second form of communication, in our opinion.
Sorry, may I add something to this? Another reason, sorry, because we are together in the same room and there's echo. Okay. Another reason to consider pantomime as a form of proto-language is that in our model, in our hypothesis, it possesses some important features which are kept in verbal language. So the reference to persuasion is the key component here. So when verbal language emerges, does not replace these characteristics, but just enhances it, okay, through the use of structures, grammatical structures, and so on.
Okay, so thanks a lot once again, Francesco, Alessandra, Ines, and we miss you here, but it's good to see you. And yes, so that's, we can applaud perhaps. And now's the time for a well-deserved break. The next session will be in half an hour, the last session before the round table. Thanks a lot, and see you soon.